There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of the land we have recorded this podcast on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures.
When Natasha Sholl was 23 years old, she sat down to a Valentine's Day dinner with her partner Rob. He was 27 and he was a doctor, just like Natasha's brothers. They'd been dating for 4 years, but they had only just moved in together. The boxes were barely unpacked and it was still in the stage where coexisting just in the same space was new and novel and exciting and romantic. And it was Valentine's Day, their first Valentine's Day as a couple living together. They went out to a restaurant, drank red wine, ate delicious pasta, talked about their future, and afterwards they went to bed on what should have been a happy but mostly forgettable night. But it wasn't either of those things, because Rob never woke up. From Mamamia, you're listening to No Filter, a podcast where people speak candidly about their lives and aren't afraid to be vulnerable. I'm Mia Friedman. I'll be honest, I really didn't want to do this interview. The circumstances of Rob's death and Natasha's loss just felt too sad. Because unbelievably, this wasn't even the last time Natasha's life would be upended by sudden adult death syndrome. So I'll admit, when her book, Found Wanting, it's called, when it arrived on my desk, I put it aside. Not because I didn't think her story was valuable and heartfelt, or not because I didn't admire her generosity and bravery in telling it, but I just couldn't. But Natasha was persistent. She reached out again and she told me that she had some important things to say about what happens when your life suddenly veers off course. And she promised me that it wasn't the type of thing that you would usually read in a grief memoir. She told me about dark humour and why she thinks post-traumatic growth can be rubbish. I picked up her book and I didn't put it down. Incredibly, I laughed at times and I also gasped more than once. Here is Natasha sitting with me in the Mamamia podcast studio talking about love and loss and moving on from the worst day of her life. Natasha, if death was a food, it seems it would be quiche. Can you tell me about the quiche?
I was actually offered quiche on the plane ride up today and I had to laugh. So when my partner Rob died, people's automatic reaction was to just come with these boxes of quiche. And I don't know if it's a Jewish thing or across all cultures, but it was just like one after the other after the other. And it was like, I don't think I've ever seen so much quiche before in my life. Like someone died and someone else's first reaction was like, let's go to the bakery. Like it was just, So every time I see quiche now, I'm like, oh, who's died?
It's funny because when I heard you talking about that, I was thinking, I would have thought it would have been lasagna. But lasagna you've got to make usually. Quiche you can buy.
And it's fast.
It's fast, yeah. Where were you in those days after Rob had died?
So after Rob died, we sort of gathered at his parents' house. So they were sitting Shiva, which is the 7 days of mourning where everyone gathers. And so there were friends and family. It was sort of bustling and busy. That was sort of the central place of gathering.
So there was a lot of quiche there.
There's so much quiche.
Apart from the quiche, what are your memories of those first few days?
Just shock. It was like someone had taken me out of my life and put me in some other upside down world, and it was almost like I didn't know what to do with my body or how to exist, how to sit, how to walk. I needed to relearn all those things. You know, I didn't know how to talk. It was like people were speaking a different language, like someone had just picked you up and put you in France and you're like, no, I don't live here. This isn't my life. Like it felt very removed from the life that I knew and was comfortable in. So it was just that shock.
You went home to live with your parents.
Mm-hmm.
You and Rob had moved in quite recently to an apartment.
Mm-hmm.
So you went back to having people to take care of you.
Yeah.
How long did you stay at home after
I think
that?
about a year.
And things got, I was going to say things got worse before they got better, but You developed a pretty bad eating disorder after that, didn't you?
Yeah.
Was that about control, looking
Yeah.
back now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think before Rob died, I thought I had some semblance of control in the world, like I was in love and I'd sort of wanted this relationship. We'd had all these decisions we'd made together, all these choices we'd made together, and then I was thrust into this world that I didn't agree to. And yeah, I think it was about control, but I think a lot of it was also about shame. I felt so much shame for what had happened and the
Why
fact—
shame?
I think because I was there when he died and I couldn't save his life. I think just the fact that my life had taken on this trajectory that didn't feel natural and normal. I was living in this world that I didn't know how to manage, and I just felt constant guilt and shame and self-hatred. And it was like when we were together in this relationship, we were happy and my life was happy. And then I was in this world of mourning and grief and I just didn't know what to do with myself. And there was that element of, well, maybe he was the best thing about me and maybe I could only be my best version of myself and live a good life if he was in it. And now there was no chance for him to be in it again. And so, yeah, there was that element of just grief-stricken shame constantly.
To be so young when you lose a partner, you were 22, you know, most people who experience this are a lot older and they have more of an identity, I suppose. They have more of a life. This was your first attempt at being an adult. You're the first version of adult Natasha.
Yeah.
And it was so interconnected with Rob.
Correct.
That when that was taken away, yeah, I'm not surprised you didn't know who you were. I also wanted to ask you about the tiers of grief and the hierarchy, because the partner of someone who dies is always seen as the chief mourner, essentially. And then if they have children as well, and then probably parents and siblings and then friends. Because you were young and you guys weren't married, where did you sit in that hierarchy of grief?
I don't know where I necessarily sat according to other people, but my perception was that I was pushed quite down. And part of that was because I think people are uncomfortable with the concept of grief. So they saw me and they saw that I was quite young and they wanted to fix me because I was very broken. And so there was that kind of, well, at least you're still young and at least you can repartner. And there was no validation of you have experienced this enormous loss and let's just see you for who you are, that you've lost someone that you love, that you plan to spend the rest of your life with. And I think it came from a good place because people wanted to help. But yeah, it was very like, at least you didn't have children. I was like, I wanted to have children. Like that was the person I wanted to have children with. And now I can't, continue his memory in that way. Or, at least you're still young. You've got your whole life ahead of you. And I was like, I can't picture that life ahead of me without him in it. So yeah, it was a really complex kind of place. And people, if someone is older and has a life behind them, people sort of know where that fits. They have a reference point, whereas I feel like, I didn't have a reference point. How would anyone else have had one?
You referred to sitting Shiva. There are some traditions in the Jewish religion, depending on how orthodox you are, that some people choose to follow after the death of someone. Can you explain what some of those are and which of them you found comforting and which of them you felt a bit excluded from?
So the Shiva is the 7 days after, and I think I found that it gave me something to do because we were in shock. We didn't know what to do, and it sort of forced other people to rush to all of us, to his family, to my family, just to be present and to keep talking about him. Like it's very...
So it's 7 days where who has to gather and
So you gather at the mourner's house, which in that case was his family home, his immediate family, so not me technically, so his siblings and his parents. And then people come to the home and they bring quiche, they bring food and they take care of the people and it's that sort of very immediate aftermath of it's almost ritualised to show up,
So it's like a wake, but it goes on for 7 days.
Yes.
And it happens When does it happen?
I think almost straight away. Like the timeline starts almost immediately. In the Jewish religion, it's a very fast burial, usually within 24 hours. And yeah, it's like straight away the clock starts ticking, show up and let's get this mourning process started.
When someone dies suddenly and unexpectedly, one of the ways that we process shock is to go through what happened and ask questions and try to understand it. Is that something that you did or something people forced upon you? How did that sit with you in those days?
I think people did ask questions because it was just so...
And you were the only one that was there.
Yes, and I was the only one there. So I think that, he was completely healthy. He was in his late 20s. He was really fit. He was a doctor. So I think the shock of it, people did ask what happened because they were just trying to come to terms with it. And I kept asking the questions as well. So that wasn't necessarily something people put on me, but I was just going over what happened in my head like again and again and again, and I'd ask other people. So if he'd been taken to the hospital earlier, what would have happened? And if he was at work when he collapsed, what would have happened? Because he was a doctor, so if he'd collapsed at work. If we had a defibrillator in the apartment, what would have happened? And I just went through every single scenario to try and work out how we possibly could have had a different outcome.
Was that about reassuring yourself that you couldn't have prevented it, that there was nothing you did or didn't do or missed?
Or punishing myself? Because every time I worked through those scenarios, it was what could I have done differently and how am I to blame for the fact that this ended the way that it ended.
But even if he had have collapsed in the hospital, the result would have been the same, right?
Correct. That's what I was told, and yet I still kept asking the questions because it just didn't make sense to me. It was like we went to bed, we were happy, it was Valentine's Day, we were celebrating, we were talking about our future, and it just didn't make sense to me that that could possibly happen. It just wasn't something I could conceive of.
Did it ever?
No. Well, there were sort of two times when we had just moved in together. It was around the time of the Boxing Day tsunami. I just had this sort of desperate feeling come over me, and I said to him, if anything ever happened, because Trisha Broadbridge was on the news, I think she was talking. And
she lost her husband.
And
they were on their honeymoon, I think.
Yeah, they were on their honeymoon, and I think I've tried to look back at where it could have been. I can't remember what it was. Either she was on the news or giving a speech or something football related. And I said, I don't know how she's talking or functioning. If that happened to you, I would never survive it. And he said, you wouldn't want to, but you would. And it was like I said it from this place of desperation, and it had just washed over me. And looking back, it was almost like a premonition. I guess when you love someone so much, you sort of play around with those scenarios in your head often. But it was an actual conversation that we had that I replayed again and again. So I had his words in my head you wouldn't want to, but you would. And there was another time when we just first started dating and I was doing creative writing at university. We had to set out a novel, so it was a work of fiction. And I started writing about the grief process and someone who had lost their husband. I knew nothing about grief. I knew nothing about partner loss, but that was what I chose to write about. And, I called the two characters Sasha, my name is Natasha, and Max, and, these sort of short names similar to our own. And I guess I was playing out that scenario in my head and the grieving process. And again, I guess that's part of the shame and the blame when after it happened, I looked back on this assignment that I'd written about this woman who lost her partner. I was like, well, I caused what happened to happen because I wrote it and it's my fault.
Do you still think that?
It's difficult to let go completely because I had so many years of that. I know logically, of course not, absolutely not, but it's hard to let go of those feelings.
Tell me about the clown.
So when we were sitting Shiva, or it might have been just after, there were lots of family gathered at Rob's parents' house and everyone was sort of turning up with these boxes of quiche, and I opened the door and my aunt had turned up with her daughter who was wearing a clown suit. And I opened the door and I was like, what the fuck are you doing? And they were like, I thought it would make you happy. And it was
trying to cheer you up.
I was trying to cheer you up, but let's bring a clown to this house in the morning. And I don't even know what the context was. I'm sure there was more to the story. I don't remember if I slammed the door, but I was just like, you have to get out of here.
As if clowns aren't creepy enough.
I know. And, it was just this thing of all these people trying to help and just to do anything. And it came from such a beautiful place. And again, like the whole grieving process is so absurd. Like it's so weird. So many weird things happen. So when I was writing this, I was writing it and I was like, did that happen? That can't have happened. But it happened. But, you know, I look back now and it's like such a beautiful, hilarious moment.
Yeah.
But at the time.
What are some of the other, you know, you talk and write a lot about dark humour. What were some of the other funny things that happened at a time of such intense grief?
Well, it's funny because a few people have commented how funny the book is. And I didn't set out to write like a funny book. But when you're writing about what happened, like just the facts of it, it's so bizarre. Like life is so weird. So, you know, I wasn't trying to be funny, but life is funny. So when you write it just word for word exactly what's happening, it's ridiculous. You know, there were moments when my aunt, who came with the daughter with the clown suit, came with this, you know, giant vanilla slice, like in the moments after Robert died.
It was like the day after.
The day after. Or that day.
Or that day
Same
off,
day, yeah. And my friend Sky, who's not Jewish, looked at me and was like, is that what's happening?
Is that a Jewish thing?
Is that a Jewish thing? I'm like, I think so. I don't know. Like, I don't know.
The things you remember.
Yeah, but everything is so weird.
What are some of the things that are helpful and unhelpful that people say?
When people try and minimise the grief, and again, it comes from such a good place, people trying to help you, but it makes it worse. So there are people, again, it's like that at least, that's not helpful. The helpful thing is when people just say how it is, like that's really shit and I'm sorry you're going through this.
It's everyone rushing to put the silver lining on the cloud when you're still just processing the cloud. Is that
yes, correct.
how it feels?
Yeah. And, you know, when people say things, and I've said it too, so it's not like I'm criticising people because it's such a human reaction. When people say, oh, I can't even imagine. It's like, yes, you can. Right now you're imagining it and you're glad you're not living my life. And that's the underscore of when people are saying those things. And it's when people say, like, oh, I can't imagine. The feeling that I got was your life makes me uncomfortable and yeah, sort of this othering of I can't imagine because that could never possibly happen to me.
I once interviewed the mother of someone who she'd lost 2 children as adults, and she said the worst thing that people say to her is, I don't know how you do it, I wouldn't be able to get out of bed.
Yes.
And that always makes her angry and upset. Can you explain why?
Because there's this expectation of what it looks like to grieve. And like, I don't want to get out of bed. I'm not special. There's nothing about, you know, that mother who's lost her children. There's nothing about me that makes me any more able to manage this situation. And I think there's all that judgment. And again, what we were talking about shame before, it's that judgment of what does a grieving person look like. And I think before all this happened to me, I thought someone who had experienced that kind of loss, they wouldn't get out of bed and they wouldn't function because it would just be all-consuming. And the problem is it is all-consuming, but you still have to go to work or go to uni or look after, you know, parents or kids or whatever it is. So life doesn't stop for you. And I really wanted it to, but it didn't. The world kept spinning, which is like such a shock at the time. But yeah, that is that element of judgment of if that was me, I would, and then they project. And it's like, I've got no choice. This is what's happened and I literally have no choice in the matter.
Did you feel when you did get out of bed or when you laughed that you were betraying Rob?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because in those first few days afterwards, I mean, there was so much laughter in the house because there is that human need to talk about the person with love and therefore with humour. And because it's such an absurd situation, like there's so much dark humour. And again, not something I ever would have expected had I thought about the grieving process. But yeah, anything I did, and again, I think that was part of the eating disorder, anything I did felt like a betrayal, whether it was laughing, whether it was being too sad, whether it was eating. Like how do you sit down to breakfast when your partner's just died?
How did you learn to eat again?
It took a really long time, and I think once you've sort of been in that place, it's sort of an ongoing battle. That kind of part of your brain never switches off, but it took a really long time to just balance that out. And when I did learn to eat again, it went to the opposite extreme where it turned into, you know, bulimia and, overeating and then purging because I felt, again, so much shame of, well, I'm eating, but now what? And my body just didn't know how to function properly.
Was it almost a form of self-harm?
Absolutely.
And then falling in love again. How did that feel?
It felt like grief. It felt conflicted because it wasn't something I had planned on. After Rob died, I was like, well, that's it. That was a person I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. And again, that was that element of betrayal now. And, I met the most wonderful, patient man who never expected anything from me. Like when we met, I said, I'm not dating. I have no plans. Like he sort of said, do you want to hang out? And I think my first response was, I'm not going to sleep with you because, that's a good pickup line. And there was no pressure coming from him and all the judgment was from myself.
Did it help that he'd met Rob, that he worked in the cafe where you and Rob used to go?
Yeah, there were all these weird connections. So his cafe was a few streets away from where Rob and I had just moved in together and we used to go there all the time. And Rob loved the cafe and he used to say, because he was a doctor and he was getting quite stressed, he'd say, I just want to stop what I'm doing and I want to open a hospitality business. So they'd chat about work and hospitality. And so there was that connection. And, when I first wrote the book, Dean was one of the first people who read it. And one of the first things he said is, you have to capture Rob more. Like he was so charismatic and you have to make sure that you really capture who he was. And, he'd walk into a room and everyone would turn around. That he had that care for him. He always wanted to protect him and the space that he had in my life, which was pretty special.
Did you worry that from the outside it would look like you'd moved on and that you'd had that silly word closure on Rob's death?
Yeah.
And now you were getting on with your life?
Yeah. And I think when people were happy for me that I'd met someone, it made me really annoyed because I didn't know how to reintegrate back into society. And so they were happy that I was happy, but I was also like, but I'm still heartbroken. So how are you heartbroken and yet in love at the same time? And so, again, it was that feeling of how do I hang on to that grief and continue that relationship with Rob and also, have a life.
Interesting what you just said about continue that relationship, because when a partner dies, particularly when they die suddenly, you didn't break up. You were broken. How do you not get closure, but how do you resolve the unfinishedness of that so that you can fully commit to the next person in your life?
Yeah, I think that was something I hadn't worked through properly. And that was something that I only really learnt through writing the book. And, there was no pressure from anyone else, especially not from Dean, to ever move on. But there was that expectation that I would move forward and not live in the past. And I think that's where I was struggling to say, how do I live a life in the present when part of me is still living in the past and imagining what might have been? And I had this sort of unlived life bubbling under the surface. And, I think the power of words and writing and reading is that you can name things, and when you name them, they're less terrifying. And so for a while I hadn't even come to terms with any of that, but then I put words to it and I was able to say, yes, this is the life I would have lived and this is the life I'm living now, and they actually coexist in some way. They don't cancel each other out, and I just had to sort of make peace with that.
How does your real life, flesh and blood partner ever compete with the mystical Rob and your mystical life with Rob that will forever be perfect because it never had to happen and never had to be, made real in the real world?
Yeah, it's so hard, and he's so patient and he's so beautiful, but it's a lot. It's a big burden to ask of someone because Rob and I were really young we didn't have a mortgage, we didn't have children, we didn't have, the stress of everyday life. So
You were so much in that honeymoon phase.
yeah, we never had any big life events that we had to manage. And obviously, Dean and I have been together a really long time. A lot of that is pressure that is just imagined because Rob will forever be 27. And Dean and I have built this life together in which we always joke that we have really low expectations.
What do you mean by low expectations?
Well, just that neither of us has to die is basically that's the benchmark. The benchmark for a good time.
You both wake up in the morning.
Yeah.
It's a good day.
Set it low.
Yeah, right. That is a low expectation.
Yeah. Keep the benchmark low. But, we know each other inside out in a way that Rob and I never had the opportunity to. And Dean has seen me through so many intense life moments. They're not in competition with one another, and I never would have been with Dean had Rob not died. That's a fact. But I also wouldn't be the same person. And so much of who I am is because of what I've been through, and so much of my connection with Dean is that understanding and that support. And, I'm more than just what happened to me. But, we started our relationship in that really intense period, and he, from day one, was like, I'm all in and I'm whatever you need from me. So it's not a competition. He's his own person.
I'm Mia Friedman, and you're listening to No Filter with Natasha Sholl. The first time you slept together, and I mean sleeping, not sex, which I won't pry into, believe it or not. When someone dies in their sleep next to you, how do you ever trust sleep again, either for yourself or for anyone you love?
So we'd started seeing each other, and I just refused to ever stay at his place because, I was already a bad sleeper, and then you add that trauma onto it. So the very first night that I did stay over, I think I was awake most of the night. And even today, I'm a shocking sleeper. I really struggle with that. So, it's meant to be a safe space. It's meant to be your house, your bed, your recovery time, and it's just become this place where scary things happen. It turns the world a bit upside down because, there are certain places that you expect to be dangerous or scary, but when you're in the safety of your own house with someone that you love, that the worst can happen.
And then when you had children, most parents go and check their children to make sure they're breathing through the night. Sudden infant death syndrome is a real thing, and with Rob it was sudden adult death syndrome. It's the stuff of nightmares. Does your heart sink when the sun goes down? The lack of respite, as you say, and the lack of trust in the process of someone waking up in the morning.
Yeah, I think in some ways, because I was so anxious and it was just also overwhelming, I ended up in some respects going the exact opposite direction, where I was like, I can't be scared of every little thing. At some point, I just have to let go. So I sort of felt that once I had children and they were in my care, I sort of did let go a bit. And for things like that, like sleep, and once I found my groove and settled into motherhood. But then there are other things, like we were going on a walk up a sort of, I guess a hill cliffside face, and it was completely safe. There were barriers. I'd looked it up on the website before and it said safe for the elderly, safe for children, and I had a complete panic attack. Even though there were barriers up, I was broke into a sweat. My heart was racing because in my head they were going to fall off the edge. And even though the logical part of my brain said they're safe, they know how to walk, they're fine, all I could see the whole time was them just toppling off the edge. So for things like that, I find it still quite hard to navigate. How do I make sure that they feel safe and secure in the world, that they can go out and take risks and enjoy life without passing on my terror?
When you had kids, how did you reconcile the fact that they wouldn't exist if Rob hadn't died?
I didn't reconcile that. I found it really difficult because I have 4 amazing children. They knew about Rob, But now through this book, obviously, it's talked about slightly more.
How old are they now?
They are 11, 9, and then the twins are 7.
What do they know about Rob?
They know that I had a boyfriend before Dad and that he died and it was very sad, and that we loved each other, and that their dad is a really good husband and took care of me, and that to them is normal. It's a normal part.
Kids are pretty disinterested in their parents' lives before they came along.
But one of them said to me the other day, if you and Rob had kids, would I have been your child? And I was like, well, probably not, because, you know. And they said, but would I have had this? I probably would have had the same soul.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it was just this really interesting way of looking at the world, because they obviously can't conceive of a world in which they don't exist, because, you know, the world exists around them. So for them, it's like, well, they come from me, and so, yeah. I said, well, you wouldn't have been the same person, but they don't need an explanation for it. It just makes sense to them.
Did you ever think that Rob had come back as your children?
They have occasionally mentioned things. Like I was always looking for signs and symbols, and there was one conversation where I think we were just sitting around the dinner table, and my middle son, who I think was around 7 at the time, just out of nowhere said, oh, I think I'm Rob reborn. And it was like, where did that even come from? The maths doesn't even make sense, because he couldn't be, like, if you're looking at it really logically. But there is this essence of, you know, I don't want to dishonour Rob's memory by, you know.
Well, he could be.
Yeah.
In terms of, you know, the maths. I don't know if there is maths when it comes to reincarnation. I'm not sure.
If we're looking at this scientifically.
Yeah, that's right.
But I think there's that element of, would Rob have wanted me to live a life in which I found fulfillment and joy? And the answer is yes. And in whatever way that has come through, that's all I can.
When you got married to Dean, did you feel that you were somehow giving up your place on the hierarchy of grief and mourners for Rob?
Sort of. I felt that had already been taken from me. When we started going out, it was like I was recategorised. But in some way, us getting married, the guilt there was more, am I a good enough wife for him because I've come with this baggage and this history, and will I be able to be the kind of person that he deserves moving forward?
You kept thinking you were going to kill him, didn't you?
Yep. And so when we first started going out, half the reason I kept saying no to actually having a relationship as opposed to a friendship was, I must be cursed. There's something wrong with me, and you're taking a risk just by being with me. Because it made no sense to me that Robert died. He was in his 20s, he was healthy, he was fit. Therefore, the only reason was me. I mean, you know, it made no sense. But I must be the thing.
It's a type of magical thinking, isn't it? But not good magical thinking.
No, bad magical.
And then your brother died somewhere else that should have been really safe. He also, like Rob, was a doctor. Both your brothers are doctors. He died in his own doctor's surgery. It's like the universe is really fucking with you at this point.
Yep.
I thought a lot about your mother during that part of when I was reading your book, and about how part of her must have obviously thought, Natasha cannot live through this again, because he also died suddenly, sudden adult death syndrome again. But then she also had her own grief, because this was her baby, this was her second-born child. How did you sit in terms of the grief hierarchy after he died?
So as his sibling, I was technically in that sort of inner circle, and people knew what to do with me. Like I was a sister who had lost her brother. No one said, oh, but you've got another brother, you can replace him, as they had in that other situation. So people had a context for it. But it's funny that you talk about my mother in that way, because even now, talking about Rob's death and talking about my brother Matt's death, I have a framework for that. I can verbalise it. I can, you know, it's not an acceptance thing, but I can make sense of that pain. But when I think about my mum losing her son, it's like that's the thing that just tips me over the edge. Like I can feel it in my chest, like her pain is just something I will never be able to come to terms with, I don't think.
Were things reversed? Because she very much, after Rob's death, had to take care of you. Did you have to take care of her? Or did you want to take care of her?
I wanted to take away her pain more than anything else in the world. And I
Just like she did for you.
Yeah. And I mean, I couldn't. How can you? But it was difficult because she had always taken care of me in that way and had my, best interests at heart. And now she was suffering so much. And for a daughter to see their parents suffer in that way is just, I wanted to help her. And I felt like in the same way that people were looking out for me after Rob had died, like I was sort of in that reverse position where I still had my own pain. Like I'd lost my brother. We were very close and I was still in shock. But how do I feel my own grief? And then I was grieving for my mother as well.
Did the quiche come again?
The quiche came again. It did. My brother was married. He had 2 kids, and so the shiva was at his house. They had beautiful family photos all over the walls, and we'd see his face every time we were there, and then the door would open. There were no clowns this time, but there was...
Thank God. Some lessons were learned.
Some lessons were learned. But there was, so much quiche. Yeah, freezers full.
How was it different this time?
The shock of it was still there because, again, he was really young. He was in his 30s, and it just was not something that I conceived of as a possibility. But my body went into this, this is grief. I know this feeling.
Muscle memory.
And also I knew that, not that it had an end point, but that it would change and that it would meld and morph into something else. So when I had that initial pain, like it's physical pain when someone dies and, the sleepless nights and the shock and all of that, I had that voice at the back of my head that said, this is the immediate aftermath. The sadness will never go away. The grief will never go away, but you know what to do with it. Just have to sit in it and work through it because this will change.
Anger is one of the stages of grief. It's interesting that there's all this known and written about the 5 stages of grief, and now there's an extra one, which I'll ask you about in a second. But the 5 stages of grief are shock. You tell me what they are.
I can't remember. There's a lot of denial.
Shock, anger, denial, bargaining, acceptance.
Yeah.
Tell me about anger because, God, I would be pissed off.
Yeah.
But that's not something that people associate with grief so much, is it?
Yeah, I was so angry and I still do have those sort of rage-fueled episodes.
Who are you pissed off at?
Oh, everyone. I'm pissed off at Rob. I'm pissed off at Matt. Like, I'm really angry at them. Like, what a shitty thing to do.
So, it's fucked.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm often angry at them. Like
for abandoning you.
For abandoning. And like Matt, come on,
Yeah. You knew what I'd been through.
Yeah. And, don't leave mum like this. Don't leave dad,
Yeah.
Just come back enough already. I guess because you're so fragile or vulnerable that the anger comes through at weird times because you just can't manage your emotions properly. You can't self-regulate in a way that you maybe would have. So it's funny because people think, when something awful happens, then you learn to sort of not sweat the small stuff or all that stuff. And I'm like, wow, I sweat the small stuff constantly.
It's like you should have such perspective.
Yeah.
It's not a big deal that someone cut you off in traffic.
Yeah, no, it's a really big deal.
Yeah.
Because like, my brother died and now you're cutting me off in traffic and I can't handle that. So the anger is a lot and comes out in weird ways still.
Perspective is interesting too because you talk about the Holocaust card, like you're a descender of Holocaust survivors and in the Jewish religion, all of us, there's always that hangs over you that like, well, it wasn't as bad as the Holocaust.
Yeah, exactly. And it's sort of like that delegitimizing of grief because I wasn't in a concentration camp. I live in this sort of relatively privileged state where I have a roof over my head, I have food, I have everything, safety, comfort I could possibly need. And like my grandparents they lost partners, they lost children, they came here to give us a good life. And now, I'm not getting on with things. They came here and they just married the first person that was around them. They continued the legacy. Some Holocaust survivors, they talk a lot about their experience. Some just say nothing. And it's that thing of, do I have a right?
Is it indulgent?
Yes.
It's not indulgent.
It's not indulgent.
It's not indulgent. You think post-traumatic growth is a bit of a crock?
Yeah.
Don't you?
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
I think, and again, because society is so uncomfortable with grief, it's like people have this expectation that you will therefore be a better person. And I was like, fuck you, I don't want to be a better person. I've had these really two shit things happen. I don't want to start a charity. I'm in survival mode. Like, I'm drowning and it's really difficult to get through each day. And, I just want to make it out in one piece and remember my brother and feel sad. Like, why can't I feel sad? Something sad happened. There doesn't have to be this narrative arc where I come out the end a better person.
Having run a marathon to raise money or...
Yeah, and I think some of that is that drive because people look for meaning. Like my brother, who was older than Matt, when Matt died, I think it was a bit of a wake-up call for him. So he did turn to running and marathon running, and he went back to triathlons, and that was amazing, and it gave him purpose and drive. People would stop me in the street and say, oh, he's so amazing, he's got a PB, he's going to do the New York Marathon, isn't he amazing? And then there was this silence of like, and what have you done?
And you were like, I'm just trying to stop biting my nails.
Yes, and I still bite my nails, I still pick at them. Yeah, I don't want to be a better person.
Therapy though.
Yes.
Therapy. Tell me about therapy.
Yeah, I think it's difficult. So the first therapist I saw, I had to find a few, but when I first went to therapy after Rob died, again, that magical thinking, people said like, you need professional help. And when I went to therapy, part of me thought, well, I'm here now, so where is he? Like, you're going to tell me there's been a mistake? Sorry, he's here. Oops. And then I'll walk out and we can continue our life together. Like, there's that element of fix this. And the only way I could think of it being fixed was bring back the people I love. Like, that's it. But yeah, I think therapy, just having someone professional who is not part of your family, who doesn't give you that pity face when people see you when you've lost someone.
What does the pity face look like?
What's that?
The head tilt.
The head tilt and the ear to the side, and it's people trying to hold space for how you're feeling, but it's also and so it's their job. They see people in all sorts of situations and there's no pity face because actually that's life, and life can sometimes be really hard, and people die and there are all sorts of things that happen that why someone would come to see them. So that's normal to them. Actually, that's a normal part of life.
And you don't have to provide them any kind of redemption narrative.
Yes, I can be my worst self.
They don't expect you to have started a charity.
No. And one therapist I saw actually said to me, like when she sees on the news if something awful happens and then someone else is doing something wonderful, like they've turned it around, her first thought is, ooh, that's going to crash soon.
I've interviewed a lot of people on this show who have done exactly that, and they have channeled their feelings into starting charities or raising awareness. I always worry for them, even though I understand it can be very helpful in the time. You've helped me understand it in what you've said. It's almost like at a certain point it occurs to them that this isn't going to bring that person back. All the awareness, all of the fundraising, all of the interviews, it's still they're left with that grief.
Yes. And they have to go home at night and to, a quiet house or to whatever their personal situation is, and it's the shock of that is quite grating, I think.
I see it particularly in mothers who have lost children, in that it is a way for them to continue mothering by creating this charity or this foundation and nurturing it and nurturing the memory of trying to keep their person alive.
Yeah, and my mum was obviously, feeling a lot of grief, clearly, and, was struggling with a lot of things. And, I got a text message from someone with a link to a charity to volunteer. And it was a charity, to help new mothers who couldn't afford things. So like, making bundles of, baby things with nappies and clothing or whatever. And they said, oh, this would be great for your mum. And I thought, why would it be great for my mum to volunteer at a charity? She's just lost her son, and let her be sad about that. Like, I just pictured my mum in this sort of line of people bundling baby booties, and like she's just lost her second born, and she doesn't have to turn that into something productive. Actually, she's doing what she's meant to be doing, which is feeling immense pain, because it's a really awful situation. So, yes, so much good can come from these tragic circumstances and raising awareness and raising money. Like, there is a place for that, absolutely, and people who do that are amazing. I don't want to take away from that, but there is also a place to say when sad things happen, actually it's okay to feel sad. And
not be productive.
Yeah, that is a productive use of your time by being sad.
I wanted to ask you what you've learned about SADS, sudden adult death syndrome. I mean, it's like you couldn't make this shit up, what it's called, the fact that it happened to two men in your life who weren't even related, so it wasn't even a genetic connection. What have you learned?
So Rob died, he had like a genetic condition that he had no symptoms for, and he died in his sleep.
A heart condition?
Yeah, cardiomyopathy, whereas Matt had sort of a virus that had been affecting him. So he hadn't been feeling well. He actually had an appointment that afternoon to see a specialist. So it was a slightly different situation, but still both their hearts just stopped. And then I think in the years after, it wasn't actually just me. There are other people whose partners had died in their sleep in very similar situations. Since the book's been published, I've had emails and DMs from people who said the exact same thing happened, and they're young men. They're with no warning signs and all slightly different situations. But, you know, it's that element of you just don't know, which is scary.
There's a group of women I've observed on Instagram. They're like the young widows of Instagram. There's a group of them now. It's a club that no one wants to join or be a member of, but you can see the solace they find in each other, which is something that social media has brought us, which you didn't have the benefit of. How is it different being a young widow to being older at the age that people think you're, you know, in quote marks, supposed to lose a partner?
You know, there are so many podcasts now about grief and social media, and I didn't have that then, so I didn't know what grief looked like
or how to do it.
How to do it right. And it's amazing now that people, it's so open and it's so, you know, you see like, oh, okay, that person's dealing with it that way and that person's dealing with it that way, and they're different but they're both right. And so, yeah, I wonder how different things would be had I had given myself permission to grieve in the way that I was grieving. There was a bit of a widow setup. I was set up with a beautiful person called Sagit, and she had lost her husband while they were on their honeymoon. And, you know, she was going through grief in a completely different way. And
she was further down the track to you.
Yeah, she was further down the track. But when she was talking about sort of the immediate aftermath and that shock, you know, just to be led into someone else's life and someone else's grief, and to be given permission to say it's just really shit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's no silver lining.
There's no silver lining.
You said that the last phase of grief, it's this new one that they've discovered. Meaning. What's the meaning?
So the original stages of grief, I think it's a bit of a misunderstanding there about, I sort of assumed it was you go through one, then you go through other, you work through them, and then you come out the other side fixed. And actually the way they were designed was to say you will dip in and out of each stage, maybe not in that order, maybe in a different order constantly. And so I guess I ought to provide a framework for grieving so you feel normal, I guess. The last stage is meaning. So that was David Kessler, who helped write those original stages. His son actually died, and he was having to go through these stages that he'd talked about for years before as an expert, as a grief expert. He was now grieving, and he realised there was another stage, which was meaning. And when I first read about that, I was really annoyed. Like, there is no meaning. People didn't die for a reason. Like, this is that old stuff that people were saying at the beginning. There's no reason. There are no lessons to be learned from this. It's just something awful happened. But I guess the way he talks about it is it's not a meaning of why the person died. It's the meaning is what you do now and how you live your life now. So I guess that's what I try and take from it. And again, no silver linings, definitely not. But yeah, the meaning is not in the death. The meaning is what to do now.
And what do you think that's been for you, or what is that still for you?
I think it's just that connection with people. Like, people saved me, and to feel connected to my husband and to my kids and to my friends and to my family, and to have that and to feel connected to the people that are no longer with us, and for it all to exist in this messy, complicated way. I guess that's the meaning for me.
You'll notice that I didn't ask Natasha to go into detail about what happened the night Rob died in our conversation. I wanted to talk to her more in that interview about what happened afterwards, because as you've just heard, the night unexpectedly closed a chapter of her life that she really, really didn't want to end. But it also opened a new one, which she had to navigate through, willing or not. In her book, though, Natasha did write about that night in detail. And so she stayed in the studio after our conversation was finished, and she read that first chapter of her book that tells the story of that night. Here's a little bit of that bonus episode.
On the day he died, the business of death had already started. The more people moved and talked, the further I was taken from the last time I'd seen Rob alive, as if the milliseconds, seconds, minutes were propelled by movement. I tried my best to keep time anchored, tried to keep still. It was just making me seasick, the flurry of activity, the sound and the noise just stop. I wanted to shout, but the effort to speak would have been too much, would have pushed us further still.
To hear it in full, subscribe to Mamamia now via the link in the show notes. This episode of No Filter was produced by Gia Moylan, and the executive producer is Liz Ratliff. Natasha's book is called Found Wanting, and it's available now.